The ultimatum. The message arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, threading through Earth's quantum communication network like silk through a spider's web. Dr. Elena Santos stood at the window of the United Earth Council chamber in Geneva, watching spring rain pattern the bulletproof glass, while the holographic display behind her continued its insistent pulsing. "They call themselves the Asterian Collective," she announced to the assembled council members, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "And they're not here to make friends." Admiral James Chen, his uniform crisp despite the early hour, leaned forward in his seat. "How many ships?" "Just one." Elena turned from the window, her dark eyes reflecting the holographic star chart floating above the central table. "But it's bigger than anything we've ever built, parked just beyond lunar orbit, watching." The council chamber, normally a cacophony of competing voices and interests, had fallen into an unusual silence. 15 years after humanity's first contact with alien life, they'd grown accustomed to dealing with various spacefaring species. But this was different. The Asterians weren't here to trade, explore, or establish diplomatic relations. They were here to collect. Elena gestured, and the hologram shifted to display the message in its entirety. "The terms are simple, if you can call them that. Earth joins their protected systems network. We provide regular tributes of resources, technology, and—" She paused, her jaw tightening, "specialized biological samples. In return, we'd receive their protection and limited access to their technological database." "Protection from what?" Counselor Patel's voice carried a sharp edge. "Themselves." "They don't specify," Elena replied. "But the implications are clear enough." Admiral Chen stood, his movement drawing all eyes. At 63, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen humanity through its first stumbling steps into the cosmic arena. "What happens if we refuse?" Elena's answer came in the form of another hologram, this one showing a distant star system. The council watched in silence as the recording played out. A planet, roughly Earth-sized, its surface suddenly blooming with points of light that might have been beautiful if everyone present didn't recognize them as impact events. "That was the Centauri resistance," Elena said quietly. 3 years ago, by our calendar. Population of 8 billion. They refused to join the network." She didn't need to finish the story. The recording did that for her, showing the planet's atmosphere igniting, its oceans boiling away in a matter of hours. The silence that followed was heavier than before. "How long do we have?" Council President Martinez's voice was steady, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the table's edge. "They've given us 72 hours to begin the integration process." Elena turned back to the window, watching lightning flash in the distance. "But there's something else, something they don't know we've detected." This caught Chen's attention. "Explain." Elena waved her hand, and new data scrolled across the holographic display. "Our quantum consciousness sensors picked up anomalies from their ship. The crew, if you can call them that, they're not right. Their consciousness patterns are dulled, uniform, like copies of copies. The same technology we've been developing in secret," Chen mused, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The Quantum Consciousness Mapping Project." "Exactly." Elena faced the council fully now, her expression intense. "We thought we were pioneers in consciousness technology. But the Asterians, they're masters at it, and I don't think they're using it for scientific research." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Humanity's greatest scientific breakthrough, the ability to map, store, and potentially transfer consciousness, wasn't just a coincidence. It was an evolutionary response to a threat they hadn't even known existed. "They're not here for our resources," Counselor Patel said slowly. "Not really. They want our minds, our consciousness patterns. That's the real tribute." Elena nodded grimly. "Every species that's joined their network, their consciousness signatures show the same pattern. Dulled, standardized. They're not protecting anyone. They're harvesting them." Admiral Chen's expression hardened. Then we know what we have to do. Do we? Martins asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. They could destroy us with a thought. They could, Elena agreed. But they won't. Not immediately. They want what we have. Our consciousness patterns, our creativity, our spark. And that means we have something they need. Something worth protecting. Chen smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then let's give them our answer. Not as a species under threat, but as humanity standing its ground. Elena turned back to the quantum communicator, her fingers hovering over the controls. What should I tell them? The council chamber fell silent once more, but this time it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the quiet of resolution, of a species that had faced extinction before and survived, of a civilization that had climbed from the mud to the stars through sheer determination. Tell them, Martins said, rising to his feet, that humanity's consciousness is not for sale. Tell them we understand exactly what they are, what they've done to other species, and tell them that if they want our minds. He paused, looking around the room at the faces of Earth's leaders, seeing in them the same fire that had driven humanity from its first cave paintings to the stars themselves. They'll have to face something they've never encountered before, a species that knows its own worth. Elena's fingers moved over the controls, composing humanity's response to the greatest threat it had ever faced. Outside, the storm was building, lightning illuminating the council chamber in harsh bursts. But inside, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would shake the very foundations of the Asterian collective's power. The message was simple, direct, and carried the weight of every human who had ever looked up at the stars and dreamed. No, the hidden edge. 3 hours after Earth's refusal, Dr. Elena Santos stood in the depths of Facility Zero, humanity's most closely guarded secret. The underground complex, buried beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, hummed with the power of quantum processors that had never been acknowledged to exist. Show me again, she commanded, and the holographic display sparked to life, revealing the consciousness pattern of an Asterian crew member. The signal, captured during their brief communication, told a story that made her blood run cold. Admiral Chen stepped closer to the display, his breath misting in the facility's carefully controlled atmosphere. Like a photocopy of a photocopy, he muttered, watching the dull, repetitive pattern swirl in the air before them. Worse, Elena replied, pulling up another visualization. Look at this. This is a standard human consciousness pattern. The new display erupted in a dance of complex, interconnected waves, each pulse unique, each pattern singular. And this, she continued, overlaying the third image, is what we've detected from species already under Asterian protection. The patterns were almost identical to the Asterian crews, flat, uniform, lacking the brilliant chaos that marked natural consciousness. They're not just taking tribute, Chen realized, his voice tight. They're standardizing consciousness itself. But why? Dr. Yuki Tanaka, head of the Quantum Consciousness Project, stepped forward from the shadows where she'd been observing. Control, she said simply. Think about it. What's the hardest thing about managing an interstellar empire? Diversity. Elena answered, understanding dawning. Different species, different thoughts, different reactions. Unless you make them all think the same way, Tanaka finished. Not obvious enough to be noticed by outsiders, but enough to ensure compliance. Enough to prevent rebellion. Chen's hand clenched into a fist. And now they want to do the same to us. They'll have to find us first, Tanaka said with a grim smile, gesturing to the machinery surrounding them. The quantum processors that lined the walls weren't just for research. They were the heart of something far more ambitious. Elena brought up a new display, this one showing a web of quantum entanglement spreading across the globe. Project Aegis, she explained. We thought we were developing it to enhance human consciousness, to push our evolution forward. Instead, we accidentally created the perfect defense against consciousness manipulation. Chen finished, a spark of hope lighting his eyes. But before anyone could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Alina's hands flew over the controls, ringing up external feeds. Above the Antarctic ice, the sky was changing. Multiple ships dropping out of FTL. Chen reported, his military training taking over. Bigger than the first one. Much bigger. The Asterian response to humanity's defiance had arrived. But as Alina watched the massive ships take up position around Earth, she noticed something odd about their deployment pattern. They're not in attack formation, she said slowly. Look at their positioning. They're creating a containment grid. Tanaka's eyes widened. They're not here to destroy us. They're here to harvest us. All of us. The facility's quantum sensors began registering massive energy buildups in the Asterian fleet. But these weren't weapon signatures. They were consciousness manipulation fields, powerful enough to blanket the entire planet. They're going to try to standardize every human mind simultaneously. Tanaka breathed, horror mixing with fascination in her voice. They must have been planning this from the moment they detected our quantum consciousness research. Chen was already moving, barking orders into his communicator. Around the globe, hidden quantum processors began powering up, ready to create the largest consciousness shield ever attempted. But Alina noticed something else in the data streaming across her screens. Wait, she called out, her fingers flying over the controls. There's something different about these ships. The crew patterns, they're not all standardized. She isolated one particular consciousness signature and enhanced it. Unlike the dull, uniform patterns they'd seen before, this one showed hints of complexity, of individuality struggling to break free. Some of them are fighting it, she realized. The standardization isn't perfect. It's not permanent. Tanaka rushed to her own console, confirming the readings. She's right. The Asterians, they have to maintain the effect constantly. That's why they need so much power. That's why they need new consciousness patterns to harvest. They're fighting an endless battle against nature itself. Chen's expression hardened with determination. Then we don't just need to defend ourselves. We need to show them another way. Show all those enslaved species another way. Alina looked up at the massive ships looming above Earth, no longer seeing them as harbingers of doom, but as prison ships filled with minds yearning to break free. We're not going to just resist, she said quietly. We're going to liberate them. The facility rumbled as the quantum processors reached full power. Above them, the Asterian consciousness field began to descend through Earth's atmosphere like an invisible tide. But humanity wasn't helpless. In secret laboratories and hidden bunkers around the world, the quantum shield network hummed to life, ready to protect not just human consciousness, but the very essence of free will itself. The real battle for humanity's soul was about to begin, and for the first time in their long history of conquest, the Asterians were about to face something they'd never encountered before, a species that could not only resist their mental manipulation, but had the power to break it entirely. As the quantum shields engaged, Alina sent a final message to the Asterian fleet. It contained no words, just a consciousness pattern, pure, unaltered, gloriously chaotic, a reminder of what they'd lost and a promise of what they could reclaim. The war for the mind of the galaxy had begun. The counter. The quantum shield held, but barely. 12 hours into what historians would later call the Consciousness War, Earth glowed with an invisible barrier of quantum entanglement, deflecting wave after wave of Asterian mental assault. In Facility Zero's command center, Alina watched the global defense grid status with growing concern. Shield integrity at 78% and falling. Tanaka reported, her fingers dancing across holographic displays. They're learning, adapting their attack patterns. Admiral Chen studied the tactical overlay, watching the Asterian ships shift positions around Earth like pieces on a cosmic chessboard. They're not just testing our defenses, he observed. They're studying us. Good, Alina said, surprising both of them. Let them study. Let them see exactly what they're dealing with. She brought up a new display, showing the consciousness patterns of the Asterian crew members closest to Earth's quantum shield. Look at this. Every time their standardization field hits our shield, it creates a resonance. Tanaka moved closer, her eyes widening as she analyzed the data. The resonance, it's affecting their own consciousness patterns. Our shield isn't just blocking them. It's reminding them of what they used to be. Alina finished. Every attack makes their own standardization weaker. Chen's tactical mind immediately grasped the implications. Then we don't just defend. We push back. Operation Mindforge launched within the hour. Across the globe, quantum processors recalibrated, transforming Earth's defensive shield into something entirely new. Instead of simply blocking the Asterian consciousness field, it began reflecting it back, amplified by the natural complexity of human thought patterns. The effect was immediate and devastating. On the nearest Asterian ships, crew members began experiencing something they hadn't felt in centuries: individual thought. "We're receiving transmissions," Alina announced, monitoring the quantum communications array. Fragmented, confused, but definitely not standardized. They're remembering who they were. But the Asterian leadership wasn't going to let their control slip away easily. The largest ships in their fleet, massive vessels that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built, began charging what appeared to be their primary weapons. "Energy buildup detected," Chen reported grimly. "They're going to try to break through with brute force." Alina shared a look with Tanaka. They had anticipated this possibility, had prepared for it, but the risk was enormous. "Initialize Protocol Omega," Alina commanded. Tanaka's hands hesitated over the controls. "Alina, if we're wrong about this." "We're not wrong." Alina's voice carried absolute conviction. Humanity didn't develop consciousness shielding by accident. We evolved it because somewhere, deep in our collective memory, we remembered facing this threat before. Around the world, secondary quantum processors activated, linking into the main shield network. But these weren't just defensive systems. They were broadcasting a signal that human scientists had discovered buried deep in human DNA itself, a genetic memory of resistance to consciousness manipulation. The Asterian ships fired. Energy beams of impossible power lanced down from orbit, striking Earth's quantum shield. For a moment, the barrier flickered, threatening to collapse under the onslaught. But then something extraordinary happened. The shield didn't just hold. It began to sing. Not with sound, but with consciousness patterns. The combined mental resistance of billions of human minds, amplified by the quantum network, transformed the Asterian attack into a symphony of defiance. Each impact added to the resonance, building into a wave of pure, unfiltered consciousness that rippled back through space. "Look," Tanaka cried, pointing to her displays. The consciousness patterns of entire Asterian ships were fluctuating, breaking free from standardization. And not just the Asterians. On planets across the galaxy, species that had lived under mental suppression for generations began to wake up. "They're receiving our signal," Alina breathed, watching the data stream in. The quantum resonance. It's spreading through their entire network. Chen's tactical display was lighting up with new signatures. "We've got ships breaking formation. Multiple vessels powering down their consciousness fields. Some are even turning on their own command ships." But victory wouldn't come easily. The Asterian leadership, sensing their control slipping away, launched a desperate countermeasure. From their flagship came a new type of consciousness wave, not attempting to standardize, but to erase. "They're trying to blank all consciousness patterns," Tanaka reported, horror in her voice, "including their own crews. They'd rather have mindless drones than free minds." Alina's response was immediate. "Full power to the resonance field. Send them everything. Every human thought pattern, every memory, every dream and fear and hope. Show them what they're trying to destroy." The quantum processors screamed as they channeled the combined consciousness of humanity into a single, overwhelming broadcast. This wasn't just resistance. It was an affirmation of everything that made consciousness precious. creativity, individuality, the very spark of self-awareness that the Asterians had tried to suppress. In orbit, ships began to go dark as their crews, faced with the full complexity of unconstrained thought, broke free from centuries of mental conditioning. The Asterian command structure, built on absolute control of consciousness, began to crumble. But the battle was far from over. As the first wave of ships fell silent, Alina detected a massive power surge from the Asterian flagship. They were preparing something bigger, something that would test humanity's resistance to its absolute limit. "They're not done," she announced, her voice steady despite the tension. "They're gathering their remaining forces for one final attack. And this time," she studied the energy readings with growing concern, "this time, they're not trying to control us. They're trying to prove that freedom of thought itself is a mistake." The real test of humanity's resolve was about to begin, and the fate of consciousness itself hung in the balance. Breaking point. The Asterian flagship's attack came not as a wave or a beam, but as a void, a complete absence of consciousness that began eating away at the quantum shield like acid through metal. In Facility Zero, alarms screamed as sensors registered the impossible. A weapon designed to create absolute nothing. "They're not just trying to standardize consciousness anymore," Tanaka whispered, watching the void expand. "They're trying to prove that consciousness itself is the enemy." Alina's hands flew across her console, analyzing the attack. "It's like they're weaponizing the concept of oblivion itself. Every mind it touches just stops." Admiral Chen's tactical display showed the void spreading, creating dead zones in Earth's defense grid. "We're losing sections of the shield. Multiple breaches detected in the northern hemisphere." The first reports started coming in from affected areas. People falling into catatonic states, their consciousness patterns completely flat. It wasn't death. It was something worse. The complete absence of self. "We can't match their power," Tanaka said, her voice trembling. "Our quantum processors are already at maximum capacity." But Alina wasn't listening. She was staring at a different set of readings, her eyes wide with sudden understanding. "We don't need to match their power," she said slowly. "Look at this. The void. It's not just affecting our shield. It's affecting them too. They're sacrificing their own people to prove their point." Chen moved to her station, studying the data. The Asterian crews, their consciousness patterns aren't just being standardized anymore. They're being erased completely. Because they never understood what consciousness really is, Alina realized. They thought they could control it, standardize it, even erase it. But consciousness isn't just patterns of quantum energy. It's... She paused, a plan forming in her mind. A desperate plan, but one that might be humanity's only hope. "Shut down the shield," she commanded. "What?" Chen and Tanaka spoke simultaneously, their voices sharp with disbelief. "Not the processors, just the defensive barrier. Instead of trying to block their void, we're going to fill it with everything we are." Understanding dawned in Tanaka's eyes. The resonance effect. If we broadcast raw consciousness patterns directly into their weapon, we show them what they've forgotten, Alina finished. The true nature of consciousness. Chen studied both women for a long moment, then nodded sharply. "Do it." The order went out worldwide. Earth's quantum shield transformed from a barrier into a broadcast array of unprecedented power. Instead of trying to block the void, humanity embraced it, filling it with the one thing the Asterians had never truly understood: the raw, unfiltered experience of being alive. Through the quantum network flowed not just thoughts and memories, but the fundamental essence of human consciousness. The joy of a child's first steps, the grief of losing a loved one, the wonder of scientific discovery, the passion of artistic creation, the complexity of moral choice, the power of love, the dignity of free will. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The void continued to spread, threatening to engulf the planet entirely. But then, something changed. "Look at the Asterian ships," Chen said quietly. On their screens, they watched as consciousness patterns began to reappear among the Asterian crews, not the dull, standardized patterns of before, but brilliant, chaotic bursts of individual thought. The void weapon, designed to erase consciousness, was instead becoming a conduit for its rebirth. "They're remembering," Tanaka breathed, watching the data stream in. Not just their own consciousness, but the very concept of individual thought. "We're not just fighting their weapon, we're healing them." The effect spread through the Asterian fleet like a wave of awakening. Ships began powering down their weapons as their crews, experiencing true consciousness for the first time in centuries, rejected the very concept of standardization. But the flagship remained, its void weapon still active, still trying to prove that consciousness was a flaw to be corrected. Its commander, the last holdout of the old order, refused to accept the evidence before him. Elena made a decision. She opened a direct quantum channel to the flagship, broadcasting not just consciousness patterns, but a simple message. "This is what you've forgotten. This is what you've been fighting. Not an enemy to be conquered, but your own true nature." The void weapon faltered, fluctuated, and finally collapsed. In its place arose something unprecedented: the consciousness patterns of the Asterian leadership themselves, experiencing genuine individual thought for the first time in millennia. The flagship's main communication channel crackled to life. The voice that came through was uncertain, almost childlike in its wonder. Remember, we were wrong. All this time, we thought we were perfecting consciousness. Instead, we were destroying the very thing that makes it valuable." Around Earth, the remaining Asterian ships began powering down their consciousness suppression fields. Across the galaxy, species that had lived under mental domination for generations began to wake up, their minds finally free to experience the full spectrum of consciousness. But as Elena watched the data stream in, she realized this wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of something much larger. The galaxy was awakening, and humanity had proven itself not just resistant to mental manipulation, but capable of healing the very wounds that standardization had inflicted on countless species. The real work was just beginning. Revolution's dawn. 1 month after the collapse of the Asterian consciousness suppression network, Earth had become the center of a galactic renaissance. Ships from hundreds of species arrived daily, their crews seeking not tribute or submission, but understanding. They came to learn how humanity had not only resisted standardization, but helped free the galaxy from mental bondage. In the expanded facilities beneath Antarctica, Dr. Elena Santos stood before a gathering unprecedented in galactic history. Representatives from over 300 formerly suppressed species filled the chamber, their consciousness patterns a beautiful chaos of individual thought. "The quantum resonance technology is yours," she announced, gesturing to the holographic schematics floating above the assembly. "We're not here to create a new empire. We're here to ensure that consciousness suppression can never happen again." Admiral Chen, now serving as Earth's representative to the newly formed Galactic Consciousness Congress, stepped forward. "But technology alone isn't enough. We need to understand how this happened, and how to prevent it." The former Asterian first speaker, their consciousness pattern now vibrant with individual thought, rose to address the gathering. Their form, tall and crystalline, caught the light as they moved. "We began with good intentions," they said, their voice carrying the weight of centuries. "We thought standardization would bring peace, eliminate conflict, create perfect order. We forgot that consciousness itself emerges from chaos, from the beautiful uncertainty of individual thought." Yuki Tanaka, who had been analyzing the data from the liberated species, brought up a new display. "The damage is reversible," she reported. "Every species we've studied shows natural consciousness patterns reasserting themselves once the suppression field is removed. The mind wants to be free. But freedom brought its own challenges. As species across the galaxy awakened to true consciousness, centuries of suppressed emotions and thoughts emerged. Some worlds faced chaos as their populations struggled to handle individual thought after generations of standardization. We need to help them. Alina insisted during a private meeting with Earth's leadership, not by controlling them, but by showing them how to handle freedom responsibly. The solution emerged from humanity's own history. Earth began sending teams of consciousness specialists, scientists, philosophers, artists, and teachers to help species rediscover their individual identities. These teams carried not just quantum technology, but something more valuable: the experience of maintaining individuality while building cooperative societies. The Asterians themselves, once the suppressors of consciousness, became its most dedicated students. Their ships, once carriers of mental bondage, were transformed into libraries of thought, preserving and sharing the unique consciousness patterns of every species they encountered. 6 months after the liberation, Alina stood on the observation deck of humanity's first diplomatic vessel, watching stars streak by in FTL. They were heading to the Galactic core, where the largest congregation of awakened species had gathered to form something new. Not an empire built on standardization, but a coalition founded on the principle of consciousness diversity. "We're picking up something interesting," Tanaka called from her station. "The quantum consciousness patterns of different species, they're harmonizing naturally, not becoming standardized, but complementing each other." Alina studied the readings. The consciousness patterns of dozens of species were interacting in ways they'd never imagined possible, creating something greater than the sum of their parts. It wasn't standardization, it was synthesis, a natural evolution of thought itself. "They're learning from each other," Chen observed, "creating new forms of consciousness through voluntary cooperation." The ship's quantum sensors detected more than just consciousness patterns now. They picked up art, music, poetry, expressions of awakened minds discovering their own creativity for the first time in centuries. Some species, Alina learned, had already begun incorporating quantum resonance into their artistic expressions, creating works that could be experienced not just through physical senses, but through direct consciousness interaction. As their ship approached the Galactic core, Alina received a transmission from Earth. The Quantum Consciousness Project had made another breakthrough. They discovered that the human resistance to standardization wasn't just a genetic accident. It was the result of ancient contact with the Asterians themselves. Humanity had faced standardization before, in its prehistoric past, and had evolved natural defenses. "We were never alone," Alina realized, sharing the findings with her colleagues. "Our ancestors fought this battle before. They won by evolving, by making resistance to mental control part of our very nature." The implications were staggering. Humanity hadn't just resisted standardization. They had been unconsciously preparing for this moment for millions of years. The quantum consciousness technology they developed wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of an evolutionary journey they hadn't even known they were on. As their ship dropped out of FTL near the Galactic core, they were greeted by a sight that would have been impossible just months before: a vast gathering of ships from every known species, their consciousness patterns broadcasting freely into space, not in submission or standardization, but in celebration of their differences. The former Asterian flagship, now transformed into a center for consciousness studies, transmitted a message that spread across the galaxy. "For too long, we sought perfection through uniformity. We now understand that true perfection lies in diversity, in the infinite variations of thought that consciousness can create." Alina stood at her station, watching the consciousness patterns of 1,000 species dance across her displays. This wasn't the end of a war. It was the beginning of a renaissance. Humanity had not just prevented the extinction of free will. They had helped birth a new age of consciousness itself. The galaxy was awake, and it would never sleep again.